Water companies in New England were trying to improve their tap water's taste and applied a new type of lining to the municipal pipes. Only years later, with huge numbers of residents dying from cancer, was the damage truly understood. This is the true story of the New England poisoned pipe scandal. Between 1985 and 1990, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health published several horrifying data sets. In Cape Cod, cancer and cancer mortality were off the charts. The citizens demanded an investigation, and several potential causes were identified. One was chemical contamination from the Massachusetts Military Reservation, specifically Otis Air Force Base. Another was toxic pesticides used to treat Cape Cod's famous cranberry bogs. And another was contamination of water pipes with a chemical known as PERC. This process had begun decades earlier. In the 60s, some residents of Rhode Island had begun noticing funny tastes in their tap water. They called their water suppliers, who conducted an investigation and determined that calcium compounds were leaching out of the new pipes they'd installed. These pipes were made of cement reinforced with asbestos. They were both lighter and cheaper than metallic pipes. To combat them leaching calcium, the Water Supply Board of Providence, Rhode Island approved a process of lining their insides with vinyl. In order for this vinyl to be sprayed on, it had to be dissolved in a liquid, so the manufacturers devised a slurry of 30% vinyl toluene resin and 70% tetrachloroethylene, aka perchloroethylene or PERC. PERC is a highly toxic and carcinogenic chemical. They believed it would simply evaporate if the pipes were left out to cure before installation, and went ahead with the process. Over the next few years, this type of lining became more popular in response to fears that asbestos fibers from the pipes could also leach into the water. Between 1968 and 1980, over 1,000 miles of vinyl-lined asbestos cement pipe were installed in New England water systems, a high proportion in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which was experiencing a population boom. Almost a decade into the process, in 1976, the EPA happened to be testing the water around Brenton Park, Rhode Island, and saw an unexpected peak on their gas chromatograph. This was identified as PERC. However, since they had been testing for different chemicals and hadn't detected PERC at the other sample sites, they assumed it was simply a local contamination and ignored it. 2 years later, Rhode Island testers returned a second sample with elevated PERC. Someone realized that both sites had been fitted with the lined pipes, and an inquiry was undertaken. However, it wouldn't be until 2 years after that, in January 1980, that they would finally receive confirmation from an EPA lab that the lined pipes were indeed leaching PERC directly into the drinking water. That same month, Massachusetts discovered the problem for itself. Their Department of Environmental Quality Engineering had been conducting tests in response to the discovery of some toxic waste barrels in a storage area. The water underneath showed levels of over 1,000 parts per billion of PERC. Once all this information was shared, the New England state agencies and EPA began scrambling to determine the problem's extent and severity. They held meetings with each other and the manufacturers, conducted testing, and deliberated potential solutions. In April, they still had not announced the problem to the public when the Boston Globe got wind and broke the story. This forced the agencies to react. Since there was little research on human exposure to PERC through drinking water at the time, the EPA decided they should seek to reduce its concentration in the water to at or below an action level of 40 parts per billion. The next question was how to accomplish this. The obvious solution was to simply replace the pipes. However, in Massachusetts alone, the cost of pipe replacement was estimated to over $157 million, before even accounting for ancillary costs like street repairs. On this basis, since there were no state funds available, pipe replacement was judged to be impractical. Several other options were considered and tested until eventually they settled on a flushing or bleeding plan. Since the longer the water sat in the pipes, the more PERC it absorbed, the idea was to simply discharge water out into the streets at a high enough rate to keep PERC concentrations below 40 parts per billion. Over time, the amount of PERC leaching from the pipes would decrease and the flushing would cease to be necessary. They believed this approach would be cost-effective and did not predict any significant environmental harm. Over a decade later, the District of Sandwich was still pumping to waste around 16% of its total water, over 100 million gallons a year, exceeding its Water Management Act permit. Eventually, the companies were able to flush enough water to bring PERC levels down to the EPA's action level of 40 parts per billion. In fact, though, this level was just a 6-month target average, and concentrations were permitted to be higher for periods of weeks, up to 175 parts per billion. The current maximum level of PERC in drinking water allowed by the EPA is 5 parts per billion. When the cancer epidemic was discovered years later, the investigation fell to Anne Aschengrau, professor of epidemiology at the Boston University School of Public Health. As part of her research into the issue, Aschengrau gathered data from the water companies, including where the vinyl-lined pipes had been placed, along with the size of the pipes, installation dates, and the direction of water flow. This allowed her to model which houses had been exposed and when. Then she and her staff sorted through thousands of birth certificates, matching names with addresses and asking residents to contribute health information to the study. This health data from the residents, cross-referenced with contamination data from the water companies, allowed Aschengrau to establish links between the PERC-contaminated water and health consequences. To date, her research has shown significant increases in multiple types of cancer, behavioral issues like drug use disorders, mental illness like PTSD, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, breathing issues, pregnancy issues and birth defects, and brain problems like long-term neurotoxicity and decreased neuropsychological performance. In 2016, Executive Director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, Ed DeWitt, was asked to comment on the issue. He said, "I think the attitude is that we have professional people running our public water supplies, and we can trust and rely on them. And increasingly, the evidence has been, well, not so fast." Today, PERC is still used as a degreaser and in various industrial processes. Perhaps the biggest source of public exposure is dry cleaning. PERC is still the primary solvent with which clothes are washed at most dry cleaning facilities in the USA, though the state of California has phased out its use for this purpose.